Book Week 2020. Welcome to Alaska Book Week 2025. I'm Ed Schoenfeld, and I'm going to be talking to my wife, Betsy Longenbaugh, the famous author of true crime, nonfiction, and fiction. But first, she's going to read from her latest book, Death in the Underworld.
I'm going to start by reading an account of the main detective in the story, a guy named Leshke, who's been called to the scene of a crime in Douglas, Alaska. This is set in 1916. The ferry pulled up to the dock in Treadwell, where he could see the magnificent mansion that was the residence for the mine superintendent, just a couple of blocks from the end of the dock. The ferry skipper eased the boat to the dock, idled the engine, and stepped onto the dock with the mooring rope in one easy movement. 3 people stepped off, all of them appearing to be workers at Treadwell, and a couple stepped on. The man held the hand of his partner, helping her make the small but potentially watery step between the dock and boat. They went into the cabin to get out of the rain, but not before Leshke heard the man say to the woman, "You'll feel safer in Juneau." It shouldn't surprise him the word was out about the murder, if that was what the man referenced. He'd worked in Alaska for the past 18 months and knew how fast gossip traveled and how very wrong it could be. Now he prepared to face a coroner's jury, assuming that Douglas Commissioner Henson, the man whose job included acting as coroner, had gotten those 6 men to the scene of the crime as quickly as he was headed there. The coroner's jury was a tool in common use elsewhere, but with Alaska being a territory and not a state yet, they were more frequently used here. Frank Leshke's feelings about the juries were mixed. In his role as a Pinkerton detective and now as a deputy federal marshal, Leshke had seen capable and educated juries, but had also seen men swayed too easily by the authority figures around them. He hoped this jury would be considered and methodical, as he preferred it to be when he investigated a crime. Coroner's juries were 6 men, usually chosen from among people known to the authorities and paid a few dollars for their service. Of course, anyone who was Alaska Native, Asian, or otherwise non-white couldn't serve. Leshke didn't envy the jurors the job. They were called to every suspicious death and were expected to view the body at the scene if possible and to interview witnesses. Their main task was to determine cause of death, but Leshke had known of coroner's juries who also named the person who killed the victim or even named the murder as being in self-defense. Just the year before, a young woman whose estranged husband had tried to strangle her on the street in Juneau had pulled a gun from her pocket and shot him. That one bullet had gone upward through his abdomen and into his heart. She was found to have killed him in self-defense by the coroner's jury, recalled Leshke, although he thought her job as a housemaid to one of the more powerful businessmen in town may have nudged the jury toward its decision, especially when the police had released the woman to her employer at the employer's request. Leshke again hoped that today's jury would be composed of men with a responsible outlook. The deputy marshal walked onto the dock in Douglas, right behind the ferry skipper, who had again brought the boat smoothly to the pier. Leshke tipped his hat to the skipper and walked up the dock, turning right on First Street. To his left, Leshke passed the Douglas Opera House, a place he had frequented for the beer, but not the female company. Leshke had seen enough violence and venereal disease to be wary of the demi-monde. He had sometimes enjoyed the company of a willing widow, but it had been a while since he spent the night elsewhere and didn't see that changing soon. His detective work, first as a Pinkerton agent and now as a federal marshal, didn't lend itself to marriage. He walked down First Street on the broad planked street, passing a cigar store, 2 pool halls, and a carpenter shop. The shop was at the end of one block, and the next 2 blocks were the restricted district. It was certainly easy to keep this area restricted, thought Leshke, who noted that the 2 blocks ended with, somewhat incongruently, a dairy barn and then the beach. As he approached number 7, the cabin belonging to Rosie Brown, he saw a dairy hand herding the cows back into the barn, coming down the long, steep road from the less developed part of town. He suspected the cows must be taken back and forth each day to find grazing up that hill. The little cabins, also called cribs, that the prostitutes inhabited, were close together and generally not bigger than one room, although he noted 2 larger houses that were probably occupied by more than one working girl. As Deputy Marshal Frank Leshke entered number 7, he saw another young deputy marshal posted outside, which almost certainly meant the jury was inside. A few other people stood outside the cabin trying to get a glimpse inside. He realized that having the crime occur in the restricted district cut down on onlookers, since no respectable person would be seen in the neighborhood, especially during daylight hours. Leshke greeted the young marshal, a man he knew as Deputy Marshal Matthew McIntyre, and made his way inside. It was tight quarters. He counted 8 people, the 6 jurors, another marshal, and a young woman who appeared to be answering questions from jury members. He introduced himself as the deputy marshal assigned to investigate the case, recognizing 3 of the jurors. 2 owned stores in Douglas, and one was a miner whom Leshke had interviewed during the Krause investigation. They all seemed relieved to see him. Perhaps they thought having a trained detective took some pressure off their decision-making. Leshke thought it wasn't going to work that way. The young woman was named Fanny Miller, and she was a neighbor of Rosie's and had found Rosie's body. Leshke tried to make himself as inconspicuous as possible and prepared to hear her story. First, he examined the front room of the 2-room cabin. The group was standing in the front room. The door to the back room was shut. Leshke saw a wood stove next to a small stack of wood, a water basin and jug on a washstand, and 2 chairs and a table. An open cupboard held a few dishes and some cans of food. The table held 2 half-empty glasses and a bottle of beer. The basin was half filled with pink-tinged water, a towel lying next to it. The white towel had bright red blotches, with some pink areas where someone had apparently wiped wet hands. On the wall behind the washstand, a red handprint stood out against the white paint. Leshke imagined the murderer leaning against the wall to catch his breath before washing his hands in the basin. Frank Leshke waited to hear Fanny Miller's story.
And that was, or is, Betsy Longenbaugh reading from her book, Death in the Underworld. Betsy is also the author of 2 nonfiction books. This is the first one, Forgotten Murders from Alaska's Capital, which includes 10 stories of murders that really aren't well known in this area where we live, and a second book, a sequel basically, called Forgotten Murders from Alaska, which will include other communities. That isn't out yet, but it's in the hands of the publisher and should be released sometime next year. So I'm going to ask Betsy a few questions about her writing, and she always has really good answers. So, Betsy, you've written a novel based on a murder case. You've written 2 books about, as a total, 20 different murders. Why murder?
That's a great question. And I suspect we all know that murder is a very popular topic right now. There are 100 podcasts where people discuss murders and come up with alternative answers and delve into sometimes kind of crazy theories about it. Historic murder, however, to me is of special interest because not only is the story unknown, it's not something people have any sort of awareness of or stake in, but it also is placed in a setting that I find really interesting. I'm almost a lifelong Alaskan. I moved here when I was 6, and I have always been interested in history and the history of Alaska. So since the murders that I write about occurred before statehood in 1959, I'm also writing about the setting in which those crimes occurred and how that setting affected both the possibility of that crime happening, whether it was going to actually be found out, whether somebody was going to be arrested, and then consequently after arrested, tried, convicted, and what happened after that. So to me, it's more than just the mystery of why someone was killed, but also the mystery of the history, so to speak.
Now, you mentioned that these are all historic murders that you're
Mhm.
covering before statehood. There's a lot of cases since then that there's actually more information available on. Why did you choose studying and writing about historic murder?
Well, all this topic came from a series of walking tours that Ed and I put together. And the original plan had been that Ed would talk about some of the murder cases that he covered as a reporter. He covered some very significant murder cases. And I thought it would be interesting to have his take on these contemporary murder cases, and then I would talk about a few historic murder cases. And we did about 2 tours that way, and it was becoming quickly clear that the contemporary murder cases still opened a lot of trauma for our listeners. We had people on the tours who had, for example, been an elementary school teacher to one of the defendants. We had people who had served on juries. We had somebody from our church write us an email saying, could we do this? Could we do this historic murder story without saying who the killer was, because he's already back from jail and he was really a good guy. Now, no, we can't, but no, I don't want to traumatize anybody else. And as newspaper reporters, Ed and I know how hard these stories are. We've talked to survivors, we've talked to witnesses. These are difficult, difficult topics, and to bring them up simply for entertainment purposes in one way seemed unnecessary. So we ditched all our contemporary murders and just decided to focus solely on historic murders, or as I like to say, on people who would be dead anyway. And I think that has worked out pretty well, don't you?
I do. I do. So you have written nonfiction, 2 nonfiction books, although one before this novel. Why did you decide to write a novel?
Well, all my life, my professional life, I have written almost exclusively on nonfiction. I was a technical writer and worked on a number like policies and procedures manual. I was a presenter as a Coast Guard. When I worked for the Coast Guard, I did presentations on a lot of, again, difficult topics. And I was a newspaper reporter. And I liked the nonfiction aspect of it, but I also was intrigued about whether I could even write something nonfiction. How did that even work? How do people put together these plots in their heads? I was particularly concerned about dialogue because you have very little dialogue in nonfiction work. And if you do have it, it dang well better be what somebody actually said. So I felt a great sense of freedom at the idea of writing fiction. And then I decided to try it out. I went to a little tiny studio apartment that Ed and I have over in Sitka by myself, without the pets or Ed or children or grandchildren, and spent about a month working on this fictional novel and just had an absolute ball. It went way easier than I thought it would be. In fact, dialogue became so easy to me that I sometimes had way too much of it. So, so it was a really fun change from the nonfiction books. But having said that, I still like writing nonfiction. So I'm hoping in the future I'll be able to do both those things.
So this was this book is based on an actual murder case. What was different about this killing, given that you know about a lot of them, that led to it being kind of the factual outline for Death in the Underworld?
When Ed and I have covered stories and research stories on the death of prostitutes in early Alaska, the motive was almost always the same. It was robbery. Prostitutes did well. In fact, I don't think we've come across a case where sexual assault was even part of the crime. Um, I don't think so. I I think they've all been, I'm not saying there wasn't sexual congress, but they've all been robbery. And this particular robbery happened in Douglas in the restricted district, as I was discussing and when I introduced my beginning of the book. And the woman was believed to have been killed by a man who was her husband, who called himself her husband. Everybody in town thought it was him. They'd seen him coming off the boat. They'd seen him leaving her house. It was very clear that's who it was. But he had an alibi witness, so they weren't able to convict him. Um, and the whole story was kind of peculiar. I couldn't figure who else would have killed him. How did this work? And after I had done all the research here in Juneau, I was over at the state archives where we do a lot of our work, and one of the archivists came over to me and said, "Have you seen this story?" And she handed me a story from the Anchorage newspaper in 1917, where a very enterprising reporter had actually gone to the prostitutes in Anchorage and asked them about this woman. She had actually moved to Juneau just a few months before she was killed here, Douglas, before she was killed here. And she had been living in Anchorage for more than a year. So this enterprising reporter went and found her friends and asked them about her, and they had an amazing story to tell. A story that was, frankly, when I first read it, I felt unbelievable. They said that she had been the victim of a sex trafficking ring, they called it a cabal, that operated out of Buenos Aires and targeted young Jewish girls, that she herself had been um, so-called married at age 13 by a young man who'd shown himself up at the door of her destitute family's home in Poland and offered to marry her. The family was destitute, as many Eastern European Jews were, because the anti-Semitism was so great that they didn't have much opportunity to fare well. So, so she agreed, family agreed. It seemed like a great thing. This young, wealthy American's going to be taking her away. And instead, what he did was he took her to Buenos Aires and put her in this very elaborate sex trafficking ring. Now, like I said, when I read this, I thought, wow, what a great story, but could this be true? And I did some research, because the other thing that had struck me when I was writing about prostitutes is the high number of them who were Eastern European Jewish girls. Well, and it turned out that between around 1860, 1870, and up until World War II, there was a very well-known cabal, sex trafficking ring, run out of Buenos Aires, targeting young Jewish girls. It was a very sophisticated plan. There have been books written about it. Um, Absolutely horrifying. And the way that they got what they wanted was that they had an elaborate bribery scheme in Buenos Aires, where they bribed anybody that the women would have gone to complain. They bribed police, they bribed judges, they bribed immigration officials. And if a woman went to any of those people, their so-called husband would be immediately called, and he would then come and take her, beat her, and sometimes force her into an even lower level of prostitution. So, so now I knew that it was true. And what I also knew was that the man who almost certainly killed her, the husband, had most likely bribed his alibi witness, because that was how they did things. And so um, to me, that story all suddenly became like it made sense. But that's not the story that I could tell, because the story that I could tell was he was not convicted. He was not even charged with murder. He ended up being convicted of violating the White Slavery Act and going to federal prison for 1 year. Um, and that was justice unserved. So to be able to write a novel about this, where I felt things came to a much more satisfactory end, and I was able to include this information that I had found out from that Anchorage newspaper, that was very satisfying. And that's why I chose that story to get into a novel.
Mhm. So you have real people,
Hmm.
people you read about in the newspapers, court records, in this book, in
Hmm.
Death in the Underworld. You also have fictional characters you created. How did you kind of set up the fictional characters to make it so they could seamlessly merge with the people who are real people or were real people?
Well, I wanted women to play a really big role in this story, because it's a story about a woman who is has been abused sexually and otherwise, um, by men, and I wanted her to be I wanted her to be avenged by women. So, but I also wanted to include this wonderful Pinkerton detective, Deputy Federal Marshal Frank Leschke, who was a real person, in every sense of the word, and actually was living in Juneau at the time of this crime, although so far as I can tell, he had no involvement in investigating it. So I knew I wanted to use him, and I knew that I wanted to have women be part of this. So one of the women that's part of it was a woman that was a real woman who was the best friend of the prostitute who was murdered. Her name was Fannie Miller. That was almost certainly her street name, not her real name. And then I wanted another woman who was not a prostitute but somehow knew them. And that woman is May. And May is the widow of a miner who was killed in an explosion at the Treadwell gold mine, something that happened very frequently, and is now trying to make enough money to move back to Minnesota with enough of a savings account that she won't have to be immediately dependent on her family. So she's actually working in a brothel, and the pay's good, but she's been offered by the madam at the brothel to become a prostitute, but she's very clear that's not where she wants to go. She, as I say in the novel, wants to make a living with a broom, not a room. So, but she's friendly with the victim and with her good friend Fanny, and um, she becomes a conduit between Fanny and the marshal because Fanny's terrified that the man who killed her friend is also going to kill her. So that's how I kind of combined real people and and fictional people. I also wanted to include an Alaska Native woman, and again, that's based on a real person who lived at the time, and sort of plugged her into all of this story too. So it was super fun, including some real characters, not necessarily using their names, but some real characters that I came across in my research with some made up people who just, I think, fit into their world quite nicely.
So this book has some pretty terrifying passages. You have characters who are in situations, desperate situations, where they're in fear of losing their life. And a lot of details, a lot of emotion. Did you base any of that on personal experience?
No, luckily, I didn't. I based it, if anything, on my love of suspense and thrillers. I was also really helped by our daughter Maggie. Our youngest daughter Maggie's a nurse supervisor actually at our local hospital, and she's also very clever, likes to read the same things I like to read. So on a couple of occasions when I have our heroines in a situation where I cannot figure out how I'm going to get them out of there, I would call Maggie and she would sort of say, "Well, what about this or what about that?" And that was always very inspirational. So again, fortunate that those things haven't happened to me, but I kind of like read when I read suspense or thrillers, I kind of like that extra bump of excitement.
Hmm. So the book is done. The book's been out for a while. Is this the end of this story, or does it continue?
Well, I've already written a second novel. It's very draft form, again with Frank Leschke in it, but also with another featuring another deputy federal marshal uh, and a and a female doctor, of which we now know there were four serving in Juneau between the first decade of the 1900s. There were four female doctors who came to Juneau and went into practice here for different periods of time. So I wanted to include that person as a protagonist in my second novel. And I thought it would be really fun to kill somebody in a hospital, in part because my dad was a doctor and 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 I just sort of love the idea of having, so I have this patient. He's the deputy federal marshal. He's been horribly wounded. He's lying in bed and he hears what he thinks is the murder of the patient next to him. And then the story takes off from there. And again, I think there's some good suspense. Um, Different things are happening. Some of the characters from my first book pop up, Frank Leschke certainly. Um, and it just became again a really fun story for me to tell. Like I say, I realize there's lots of sort of loose threads I have to pull out or tighten up. So it's going to take me a little while to get it to the point where I can send it to a publisher.
So, are there any authors who have influenced your writing or your thinking about writing?
Oh gosh, yeah, there are lots of them. I have read sort of the classic British mystery writers since I was young: Dorothy Sayers, Josephine Tay, Marjorie Allingham. Those have played big um, a big role in sort of how I look at the mysteries. Agatha Christie, too, by the way, who can write a darn good mystery. More recently, I've been reading more suspense and thrillers. I've read a whole lot of Lee Child, who is really good at building suspense without necessarily going the step beyond where you really wish he hadn't gone. And I don't want to do that. I want to have suspense and thrills without it getting to the point where you kind of think it's gone too far. So, so that's kind of that combination of historic, sort of classic mysteries with a little bit more suspense and a little romance, which is also fun.
Mhm. So, this obviously a murder mystery, a lot of history in there. Is there anything in particular you want people to come away from after reading this? Um, any thoughts uh, beyond, hey, that was a good read?
Well, I'm hoping with the new novel that just came out to draw some attention to this dreadful a sex trafficking ring that ran out of Buenos Aires and affected so very, 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 very many families. And I read recently in an opinion piece about um, sex crimes in the US right now, how oftentimes people see them as being an anomaly, that somebody taking advantage of a 16-year-old and using her as for sexual gratification is unusual. And as reporters, we know that's not the case. And certainly looking at these historical stories of how women were treated, we know that's not the case. So I want to remind us all that this stuff has been going on for a very long time. And it's continuing to go on way longer than, frankly, I had hoped it ever would.
Is there anything else you would like readers or potential readers or other writers to know about your writing?
Other than I really enjoy it. Ed told me once that there's a phrase for the kind of writing I do, not fiction writing I do, which is called, what was it? But seat of your
Oh,
pantsers.
right.
I do not do a lot of beforehand plotting and putting post-it notes up and trying to figure out the structure of the novel. I just start writing the story, and then I have to go back and kind of make sure the structure of the novel stays in place. So it's super fun writing that initial story, not so much fun having to go back and fix the seat of my pants.
That's an interesting literary illusion. Well, I'm Ed Schoenfeld. I've been talking to my wife, Betsy Longenbaugh, who is the author of most recently Death in the Underworld, a novel she wrote based on a true crime case from the 19 teens here in Douglas. And by the way, Douglas is part of Juneau, but used to be its own city, and some of us think it still should be. Also, she's written Forgotten Murders from Alaska's Capital and a sequel that will come out next year called Forgotten Murders, More Forgotten Murders from Alaska. And it's not just Juneau cases, it's cases from elsewhere in the state. Beyond that, if people want to find out more about Betsy and her writing and where to get her books, she has a website, truecrimealaska.com, that has a lot of information. And also, we have a Facebook page, which is Betsy Longenbaugh's author page, but you don't have to know how to spell Longenbaugh. You can just go to Facebook if you use that social media uh, service and search for True Crime Alaska, all one word, and you'll come up with it. And that includes information about our upcoming tours. We do longer presentations that are from 1 to 2 hours a couple times in the winter that take an in-depth look at one killing or a series with similarities. And you can find out there more about that. So thank you for everybody who's participating in Alaska Book Week 2025.
And thanks for having us.